Winter in the high country doesn't care if you're lonely, and it certainly doesn't care if you're in love. It just kills you if you aren't prepared. Gideon didn't want a companion. He wanted someone to boil the beans, scrub the floorboards, and keep the fire stoked while he trapped. A transaction? Board for labor. But when he pulled a half-starved Polish girl from the mud of a boomtown alley, he bought a lot more than a housekeeper. He bought his own reckoning. The boomtown of Obo was a festering wound on the side of the mountain, a place where desperate men clawed at the dirt for silver and left their decency in the mud. Gideon hated it. He hated the smell of unwashed bodies, the sour reek of spilled whiskey, and the desperate, hollow-eyed stares of people who had gambled their lives and lost. He spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the slop of the main thoroughfare, adjusting the collar of his oilskin coat against the biting October wind. Winter was coming. He could smell it. The air had that sharp, metallic edge that meant the snows were gathering behind the peaks, ready to bury the valley for 6 months. He needed to be gone before the first real freeze. Gideon kicked the mud off his boots against the wooden boardwalk and pushed through the doors of Morgan's Mercantile. The air inside was thick with the smell of coffee beans, tanned leather, and kerosene. Morgan, a balding man with ink-stained fingers, looked up from his ledger. "Gideon, didn't think I'd see you down the mountain again this year. Need flour, 50 pounds, another 10 of salt, 5 of coffee, and whatever lead you have cast," Gideon said. His voice was like a rusted hinge, coarse from disuse. He didn't speak to people unless money was changing hands. Morgan nodded, jotting it down. "Heavy winter ahead. The Indians say the caterpillars are mostly black this year. You're stocking up thick." "I need a housekeeper," Gideon said abruptly. Morgan stopped writing. He looked at Gideon, taking in the tangled greying beard, the scars crisscrossing his knuckles, the cold, flat slate of his eyes. "A housekeeper, up on the ridge. I ain't looking for a wife, Morgan. I'm looking for hands. Someone to haul the water, keep the fire from dying while I'm out checking the trap lines and mend what gets torn. I lost 3 toes to frostbite last winter because I came back to a dead stove and was too bone-tired to chop kindling. I ain't doing it again. Board and food for labor." Morgan sighed, wiping his hands on his apron. "There ain't a woman in Obo who'd go up to that rock pile with you just for flour and beans. The ones here are looking for silver barons, or they're working the saloons." "There's always someone desperate," Gideon stated. It wasn't a judgment. It was a fact of the frontier. Morgan chewed his lip. "There's the immigrant camp, behind the livery. Lot of them came out west on railroad promises that dried up. Typhoid took half of them last month. The rest are just starving slowly. Mostly Poles, some Germans. You might find someone hungry enough." Gideon left his list on the counter and walked out. The alley behind the livery was a wretched place. Lean-tos made of scrap canvas and rotting lumber huddled together against the wind. The mud here was churned with horse manure and human misery. Gideon walked through it with heavy, deliberate steps. He saw her behind a makeshift washboard, her arms plunged elbow-deep into a barrel of water that had a thin film of ice forming on the edges. She was scrubbing a heavy wool shirt. She wasn't beautiful. The frontier had beaten any softness out of her. Her face was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadows, and her skin was raw and red from the cold. Her hair, a dirty, pale blonde, was tied back, severely under a ragged wool cap. But it wasn't her looks Gideon noticed. It was her rhythm. Up-down scrub ring, relentless. Even as she shivered, even as her lips carried a blue tint, the rhythm didn't break. A drunken miner stumbled out the back door of the saloon adjacent to the livery. He unbuttoned his trousers to relieve himself, noticed the girl, and offered a leering, gap-toothed grin. He stumbled toward her, reaching out a filthy hand to grab the collar of her thin dress. Gideon stopped. He didn't intervene. He watched. The girl didn't scream. She didn't shrink back. She simply pulled the heavy sodden wool shirt out of the freezing water and swung it like a club. The wet wool hit the side of the miner's head with a sickening smack. He went down in the mud, out cold. The girl didn't look at him. She dropped the shirt back into the barrel and resumed her rhythm. Up, down, scrub ring. Gideon stepped forward. "You speak English." She stopped. She looked up at him. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue like a winter sky right before a storm. They were cautious entirely, devoid of hope, but sharp. She wiped a wet hand on her apron and gave a short, single nod. "Some. I live 2 days' ride up the mountain. It's cold. It's hard. I need a woman to keep the cabin. Chop kindling, cook the meals, mend the clothes. In exchange, you get a roof. You get a fire. You get 3 meals a day, and I won't lay a hand on you." Gideon didn't soften his voice. He didn't try to sound kind. Kindness was a lie out here. She stared at him. She looked at his massive frame, the heavy revolver on his hip, the coldness in his face. Then she looked back at the mud, at the freezing water, at the drunk bleeding into the dirt. "Food?" she asked. Her voice was raspy thick with a heavy Eastern European accent. "Bacon, beans, biscuits, venison when I shoot it." She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask his name. She turned, walked to a canvas tent, and emerged a minute later, holding a single battered carpet bag tied shut with twine. That was it. Everything she owned in the world. "I am Carolina," she said, stopping in front of him. "Gideon." He turned on his heel. "Keep up." The journey up the mountain was brutal. The trail out of Obo was an old logging road that quickly degenerated into a narrow goat path, winding its way through dense stands of lodgepole pine before breaking out onto the exposed, jagged granite of the high country. Gideon rode his roan gelding, leading a pack mule heavily laden with the winter provisions. Carolina rode a sway-backed mare he had bought off the liveryman for $5. The mare was slow and stubborn, but Carolina never complained. For 2 days they barely spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was necessary. The higher they climbed, the thinner the air became, and every breath was needed just to keep moving. The temperature plummeted with every 100 feet of elevation. By the afternoon of the first day, the wind was howling through the canyons, carrying the bitter sting of ice crystals. Gideon glanced back periodically. He expected her to be weeping. He expected her to ask to turn back. Most townfolk couldn't handle the crushing immensity of the mountains. It made them feel small, and people hated feeling small. But Carolina just sat, hunched in the saddle, her thin coat wrapped tightly around her. She was shivering violently, her knuckles white where she gripped the reins, but her eyes were fixed straight ahead on the trail. When they made dry camp that night beneath an overhang of rock, Gideon built a small, smokeless fire from dry sage and scrub pine. He tossed her a tin plate of hardtack and a thick slice of cold salt pork. She ate it mechanically, chewing the tough meat until her jaw ached, wasting nothing. Gideon went to his pack and pulled out a heavy cured buffalo robe. It smelled of smoke and old blood. He tossed it across the fire. It landed at her feet. "Wrap up," he ordered. "I ain't burying you on the trail. Digging graves wastes daylight." She didn't thank him. She pulled the heavy hide over her shoulders, burrowing into its absolute warmth, and closed her eyes. Gideon watched her for a moment. She was a survivor. Like a stray dog that had been kicked too many times, she knew when to take shelter and when to keep quiet. They reached the cabin late the next afternoon. It wasn't a picture book homestead. It was a brutalist structure of rough-hewn pine logs packed with mud and horsehair chinking. The roof was made of sod and heavy planks designed to hold the weight of 6 feet of snow. There were 2 small windows, heavily shuttered. It sat in a clearing surrounded by dark, imposing pines, utterly isolated. The nearest human being was 60 miles away. Gideon swung down from his horse. This is it. Carolina dismounted slowly, her legs stiff from the cold and the ride. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the vast, terrifying expanse of the wilderness, stretching out in every direction, a sea of dark green and grey under a heavy, bruised sky. Gideon unlocked the heavy wooden door and pushed it open. The air inside was stale, smelling of cold ash, dried hides, and old grease. The single room was perhaps 20 feet by 20. A cast-iron stove dominated the center. There was a rough table, 2 chairs, a bed, built into the far wall, and a ladder leading to a small storage loft. It was grim. It was dark. It was a box to trap heat and keep the dying out. Carolina stepped inside. She didn't cry. She didn't sigh. She set her carpet bag down by the door. She walked over to the stove, opened the iron door, and checked the ash pan. Then she turned, found a broom made of tied pine boughs leaning against the wall, and began to sweep the dirt and mouse droppings from the floorboards. Gideon stood in the doorway watching her. A strange, unfamiliar feeling flickered in his chest. It wasn't affection. It was relief. "I'll stable the animals," he said gruffly. "There's kindling in the bucket. Get a fire going." That night they established the boundaries that would define their existence. Gideon took the loft. He threw a spare canvas mattress and 2 woolen blankets down onto the floor near the stove for her. It was the warmest spot in the cabin, though the floorboards were hard. Lying in the dark, the wind began to scream around the corners of the cabin. It was a terrifying sound, like a living thing trying to tear the roof off. Gideon lay in the loft, listening. He heard the rustle of the blankets below. He heard her breathing. "It holds," Gideon said to the dark. His voice felt loud in the small space. "The roof. It holds against the wind." There was a long silence. Then from the darkness below, a soft, raspy voice replied, "I am not afraid of wind." Winter arrived not with a whisper, but with a violent, suffocating roar. 2 weeks after Carolina swept the cabin floor for the first time, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour, and then the snow began to fall. It didn't flurry. It dumped. Heavy, wet, blinding sheets of white that erased the tree line and buried the clearing. By morning the snow was 3 feet deep against the door, and it was still coming down. Gideon woke to the sound of iron clanking. He rolled over in the loft and peered over the edge. Carolina was already awake. The fire was roaring in the stove, casting a warm orange glow across the cabin. She was grinding coffee beans in the small hand mill, her movements steady and practiced. The dynamic of the cabin shifted with the snow. They were trapped now. There was no walking away, no going into town for a break. This 20 by 20 box was their entire universe. At first, her cooking was atrocious. Carolina didn't know how to use American provisions. She oversalted the beans and burned the bacon. Gideon ate it in silence, his jaw muscles working hard, refusing to complain. He had bought a housekeeper, not a chef. But Carolina was observant. She watched how the flour reacted to the altitude. She tasted the salt pork before she boiled it. By the end of the first month, the burnt offerings stopped. She began making a heavy, dense flatbread that was ugly to look at, but sat in the stomach like a warm stone, providing energy for hours. She rendered the deer fat Gideon brought back and used it to fry potatoes until they were crispy. Their communication was minimal, stripped down to the barest necessities. "Wood is low," she would say. "I'll chop," he would reply. But slowly, a silent dialogue began to emerge through their actions. Gideon noticed that his heavy canvas work coat, which had been torn on a jagged branch, appeared on his chair one morning flawlessly mended. The stitches were tiny, meticulous, and stronger than the original fabric. He didn't say thank you. But that evening when he hauled in the day's firewood, he placed 3 extra perfectly dry birch logs directly next to her pallet by the stove. She noticed. She didn't say thank you, but the next morning his coffee was exactly the way he liked it, boiled black with a single drop of cold water to settle the grounds. The silence of the mountains was absolute, pressing against the cabin walls. It was the kind of quiet that drove men mad, forcing them to listen to the echoes of their own pasts. Gideon had ghosts. He had a limp from a silver mine collapse in Nevada that flared up when the barometric pressure dropped, a constant throbbing reminder of men screaming in the dark. He didn't know what ghosts Carolina had, but he knew she had them. Sometimes when she was staring into the fire, her eyes would glaze over and her breathing would grow shallow and rapid. She would grip her arms tightly, rocking just a fraction of an inch. Gideon never interrupted those moments. He just made sure the fire stayed hot. The real test came in mid-December. Gideon was miles away running a line of beaver traps along a frozen creek bed. The sky was clear, but the air was so cold it burned the inside of his lungs. Back at the cabin, Carolina was hauling a bucket of snow to melt for wash water. She opened the heavy front door, propping it with a boot. That was when the coyote slipped into the lean-to attached to the side of the cabin. It was a starving, mangy thing driven mad by the winter. It caught the scent of the salted venison hanging from the rafters. Carolina heard the scuffle of claws on the frozen dirt. She stepped out of the doorway carrying the empty tin bucket. The coyote had leapt up, tearing a chunk of meat from a low-hanging quarter. It hit the ground, chewing frantically. It saw Carolina. It didn't run. Starvation had erased its fear. It dropped its head, bared a row of yellow broken teeth, and let out a low, rattling growl. Carolina froze. She had no gun. Gideon had taken the rifle. There was a hunting knife inside on the table, but the coyote was between her and the door. The beast lunged. Carolina didn't scream. Her survival instinct honed on cholera ships and filthy boomtown streets took over. She swung the heavy tin bucket with both hands, catching the coyote square in the snout. The animal yelped, stumbling back, but it recovered instantly, snapping at her heavy wool skirt, tearing the fabric. Carolina dropped the bucket. She grabbed the first thing her hand touched, the heavy iron-headed ash shovel leaning against the exterior logs. The coyote lunged again, going for her thigh. Carolina swung the shovel like an axe. The heavy iron edge caught the animal on the side of the neck. It went down in a heap of mangy fur and blood thrashing in the snow. Carolina didn't stop. She brought the flat of the shovel down on its head once, twice, 3 times until it stopped moving. She stood there breathing heavily, the freezing air burning her throat. She looked at the dead animal, then at the blood splattered across the pristine snow and the hem of her skirt. Gideon crested the ridge an hour later. He saw the blood in the snow from 50 yards away. His heart, which had been a cold, steady drum for a decade, suddenly seized. He dropped his traps, drawing his heavy revolver, and ran, ignoring the screaming pain in his bad knee. He burst into the clearing. Carolina. He found her sitting on a stump near the lean-to. She was holding a rag packed with snow to a shallow scratch on her wrist. The dead coyote had been dragged away from the lean-to, and the fallen venison was hanging back on its hook. Gideon lowered his gun. He looked at the dead predator. He looked at the shovel. He looked at the girl. She looked up at him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "It tried to eat the meat," she said simply. Gideon stared at her. He didn't see a hired hand anymore. He didn't see a pathetic immigrant from the mud of Obo. He saw iron. He saw a woman who belonged to the mountains just as much as he did. He walked over to her. He took his heavy leather glove off, reached out, and gently pulled the snowy rag away from her wrist to inspect the scratch. It wasn't deep. "It is okay," she whispered, her accent thick. Gideon let go of her hand. He looked into those pale blue eyes. "Yeah," Gideon said softly. "It is." January brought a cold so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against the log walls. The timber of the cabin groaned and popped in the dead of night, the sap freezing solid in the grain. They had settled into a rhythm, a functional choreography that required few words. Gideon hunted and trapped. Carolina cooked, mended, and kept the fire fed. It was a successful transaction. Until the iron jaw of a rusted beaver trap changed the terms. Gideon had been working a frozen creek bed 3 miles down the ridge. The spring on the trap was old, stiff with frost. When he tried to set the pan, his thumb slipped. The serrated iron jaws snapped shut, catching the meaty part of his left forearm. It didn't break the bone, but it tore through the thick canvas of his coat and bit deep into the muscle. He prized it open, bound the bleeding wound with a dirty strip of flannel from his undershirt, and finished running his line. Men out here didn't stop for a cut. 3 days later, the cut stopped bleeding. 2 days after that, the edges turned a bruised, angry purple. By the end of the week, a violent red line began to track its way up the veins of his inner arm, heading straight for his shoulder. Carolina noticed it first. She was serving him a plate of fried elk steak and potatoes. Gideon reached for his tin cup of coffee, and his hand shook. A violent, uncontrollable tremor. He missed the cup entirely, knocking it over. The black liquid pooled on the rough planks of the table. Gideon stared at it, confused. Sweat beaded on his forehead, though the cabin was draughty. He drew a slow, ragged breath, put his hands on the edge of the table to push himself up, and his knees simply gave out. He hit the floorboards like a felled tree, a heavy dead weight. "Gideon!" Carolina dropped the iron skillet. It clattered against the stove. She knelt beside him. His skin was burning. The heat radiating off him was unnatural, a furnace burning itself out from the inside. She managed to roll him onto his back. His eyes were half open, clouded, and unseeing. He muttered something guttural, a string of words in a frantic, panicked cadence. "The beam!" He choked out, his heavy hands clawing at the collar of his shirt. "Hold the main beam. It's coming down. God, the dark! It's coming down!" Carolina didn't know about the silver mine in Nevada. She didn't know about the 3 weeks he spent buried alive next to the crushing corpses of his crew. She only knew he was dying on her floor. She gripped him under the armpits. He outweighed her by 100 pounds of pure muscle and bone. She braced her boots against the floorboards and pulled. It was an agonizing, inch-by-inch drag. Her breath rasped in her throat. Her muscles screamed. It took her 20 minutes to drag him from the table to the bed built into the far wall. She couldn't lift him into it, so she piled every blanket, every cured hide they owned onto the floor around him. She stripped off his heavy coat and rolled up his flannel sleeve. The wound was swollen, leaking a thin, foul-smelling yellowish fluid. The skin around it was hot and tight. Infection. In the old country, a wound like this meant amputation. Up here, it meant death. Carolina went to the stove. She stoked the fire until the iron belly of the stove glowed cherry red. She poured water into a basin and set it to boil. Then she opened Gideon's heavy wooden chest. She found a straight razor, a whetstone, and a half-empty bottle of harsh, clear-grain whiskey he used for cleaning gun parts. She returned to him. Gideon was thrashing now, fighting invisible ghosts in the dark. "No!" he roared, his voice cracking. "Leave me, take the air hose." Carolina knelt beside him. She pinned his left arm down with her own knees, using her entire body weight to hold the infected limb still. She took the bottle of whiskey, uncorked it with her teeth, and poured it directly over the open wound. Gideon screamed. It was a raw animal sound that tore through the quiet of the cabin. His body arched off the floor, his right hand blindly gripping Carolina's thigh, tight enough to leave deep bruises. She didn't flinch. She didn't offer soft words. She took the straight razor, held it over a candle flame, until the steel blackened, and then pressed the blade into the swollen, infected flesh. She cut deep, opening the pocket of poison. Dark, foul blood and pus welled up immediately. She squeezed the wound with brutal efficiency, forcing the infection out until only clean, bright red blood flowed. She washed it with the boiling water, poured the last of the whiskey into the open cut, and bound it tight with clean strips of a cotton flour sack. For 3 days and 3 nights the fever waged war on Gideon's massive frame. The power dynamic of the cabin entirely inverted. The protector became the dependent. The hired hand became the master of their survival. Carolina did not sleep. She chopped the wood, a task that took her 3 times as long as it took Gideon. The heavy axe blistered her palms until they bled, the cold biting through her thin gloves, but she kept the woodpile stacked. She boiled snow for water. She forced lukewarm broth down Gideon's throat spoonful by agonizing spoonful. When he thrashed, she held him down. When he shivered so violently his teeth cracked together, she crawled under the buffalo hide with him, pressing her own body against his, using her core heat to keep him from freezing. There was no romance in it. There was only the desperate animal necessity of shared warmth. On the 4th morning the wind died down. The absolute silence of the mountain returned. Carolina was sitting in the chair by the stove, her head resting against the rough log wall, her eyes closed. Her face was gaunt, smeared with soot and exhaustion. From the floor, a rough, gravelly voice broke the silence. "You burned the coffee." Carolina opened her eyes. Gideon was looking at her. His eyes were clear. The glassy sheen of the fever was gone. He looked weak, older than his years, and hollowed out, but he was lucid. She didn't smile. She didn't cry in relief. She simply stood up, her joints popping, walked over to the stove, and pulled the blackened coffee pot off the heat. "You did not chop wood?" She replied, her voice hoarse. "I had to do it. The axe is too heavy. I had no time to watch the pot." Gideon looked at his arm. The bandage was stained, but the red lines tracking up his bicep had faded to a dull, angry pink. He looked at the massive pile of chopped wood near the door. He looked at the dark, bruised circles under Carolina's eyes and the bloodied rags wrapped around her blistered palms. He swallowed hard. His throat felt like sandpaper. "I reckon," Gideon said quietly, "you kept the roof from caving in." It was the closest thing to a thank you he had ever spoken. Carolina poured him a cup of water, handed it to him, and went back to her chair. "Drink. Tomorrow you show me how to sharpen the axe. It is dull." Recovery was a slow, humiliating process for a man who had relied entirely on his physical strength for 40 years. For the next 2 weeks, Gideon was confined to the cabin. He could barely walk across the room without losing his breath. The confinement forced a new kind of intimacy upon them. Before the fever, their orbits rarely intersected. He was outside. She was inside. Now they were trapped in 20 square feet of space, together 24 hours a day. Gideon sat at the table, whittling a piece of soft pine to pass the time. Carolina sat near the stove, mending a tear in his wool trousers. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the heavy, cautious silence of 2 strangers assessing each other. It was the comfortable, breathing silence of 2 people who had stood at the edge of the grave together and walked away. Gideon watched her hands. They were raw, calloused, the knuckles swollen from the cold water and the heavy labor. They were not the hands of a soft woman. They were the hands of a survivor. "The ship," Gideon said suddenly. Carolina stopped sewing. She didn't look up. "Morgan told me you came over on a boat. Railroad promises." Gideon set his knife down. "Who did you leave behind?" Carolina kept her eyes on the wool fabric. She pushed the iron needle through the thick cloth, pulled the thread tight. "No one." "Everyone leaves someone behind." "I did not." She tied off the thread and bit it cleanly with her teeth. She finally looked up at him. Her pale blue eyes were flat, completely devoid of self-pity. My father died of the cough in Krakow. My mother died of the cholera on the ship. We wrapped her in canvas. They put iron weights at her feet. They pushed her into the ocean. My brother, he made it to New York. Then he went to Pennsylvania to dig coal. The mine collapsed. He did not come out. Gideon felt a cold fist tighten in his gut. The mine collapsed. So, Carolina said, folding the trousers neatly, I left no one behind. They left me. She stood up, walked to his chair, and set the mended trousers on the table. She didn't look for sympathy. She simply stated the arithmetic of her life. A ledger of losses. Gideon looked at her. He saw the iron spine beneath the ragged dress. He saw a mirror of his own isolation. He reached under the table and pulled out the leather scabbard he had brought down from the loft 2 days prior. He untied the leather thongs and slid out a Winchester 1873 lever-action carbine. It was a beautiful piece of machinery, the blued steel gleaming in the lantern light. Carolina stepped back, wary of the weapon. Sit down, Gideon instructed. She hesitated, then sat back in a chair. Gideon stood up, moving slowly, and walked over to her. He held the rifle out. Take it. She took it tentatively. It was heavy. Put the stock against your shoulder. Look down the barrel. Carolina lifted the gun. She tucked the wooden stock against her right shoulder. Gideon stepped behind her. He didn't touch her, but he leaned in close. She could smell the scent of pine pitch lye soap and old leather that clung to him. It wasn't an unpleasant smell. It was grounding. Your arm is too short. Gideon murmured, his voice rumbling in his chest. You're stretching to reach the lever. If you have to fire fast, the recoil will break your collarbone and you won't be able to cycle the next round. He reached out and took the rifle from her hands. He walked back to the table, picked up a small handsaw from his tool chest, and clamped the wooden stock of the Winchester to the edge of the table. Without a word, he began to saw. Carolina watched in shock. You are breaking it. That is an expensive gun. It's useless if it doesn't fit the shooter. Gideon said, the saw biting through the polished walnut. He cut a full 2 inches off the back of the stock. He took a heavy rasp and filed the edges smooth, then reattached the steel butt plate, tapping it into place. He walked back over to her and handed it back. Try it now. Carolina raised the gun again. This time it seated perfectly into the pocket of her shoulder. Her hand rested naturally on the lever. The balance was entirely different. It felt like an extension of her arm. Better, she noted, lowering the barrel. Tomorrow we go out behind the lean-to. We shoot at stumps, Gideon said, walking back to his chair. A coyote is one thing. When the spring thaw comes, the starving bears wake up. And worse things than bears come up the trails looking for easy pickings. You need to know how to kill something from 50 yards out. He didn't say, I care about your safety. He didn't say, I want you to be protected. He just ruined a perfectly good rifle stock to ensure it fit her frame. Carolina ran her hand along the shortened, filed wood. She looked at Gideon, who was back to whittling his piece of pine as if nothing had happened. A profound, unfamiliar warmth bloomed in the center of her chest, melting a block of ice that had resided there since a canvas-wrapped body sank into the Atlantic. Thank you, Gideon, she said softly. Gideon didn't look up. He just grunted, peeling a long strip of wood away with his blade. But the tension in his shoulders dropped, and for the first time in 10 years the cabin felt like a home. March brought a false promise of spring. The days grew longer, and the sun glared off the snowpack with a blinding, harsh intensity. During the day, the top layer of snow melted, but at night the plummeting temperatures froze it solid, creating a thick, treacherous crust of ice across the entire mountain. It was a dangerous time. The game was scarce, hiding from the icy winds, and desperate men who had wintered in the lower camps began to move, driven mad by cabin fever and empty bellies. Gideon was splitting firewood behind the cabin. His strength had returned, though a deep ache lingered in his arm, where the scar tissue pulled tight. Carolina was inside boiling a pot of dried apples and cinnamon she had found in the bottom of a provisions barrel. The sweet, spicy scent drifted out the chimney. It was the smell that brought the drifter. Gideon didn't hear him approach. The crust of the snow masked the sound of footsteps, the wind rattling through the bare branches of the aspens covering the noise. The first warning was the sudden sharp silence of the mountain jays. Gideon stopped mid-swing. He rested the head of the splitting maul on the chopping block. He listened. The woods were too quiet. He dropped the maul and moved silently toward the corner of the cabin, instinctively reaching for the heavy revolver on his hip. At the front door a man stood. He was wrapped in filthy, mismatched furs and a stolen cavalry greatcoat. His face was a mass of tangled, greasy hair and frost-bitten, peeling skin. His eyes were wide, darting, and feverish. He held a rusted single-action Colt revolver in his right hand. He didn't knock. He simply kicked the heavy wooden door. It was barred from the inside, so it rattled against the frame, but held firm. "Open up!" The man screamed, his voice cracking with desperation and madness. "I smell the food. Open the damn door before I burn this box to the ground." Inside, Carolina froze. She set the wooden spoon down on the stove. She didn't scream. She didn't call for Gideon. She moved with practiced, terrifying silence to the corner of the room, picked up the modified Winchester, and jacked around into the chamber with a sharp, metallic clack. "I know you're in there," the drifter yelled, kicking the door again. "I'll shoot the lock off." Gideon stepped around the corner of the cabin. "You touch that door again, you'll lose the leg." The drifter spun around, raising the rusted Colt. He saw Gideon, a massive silhouette against the snow, his revolver drawn and leveled. The drifter laughed, a wet, hacking sound. "Just you big man on the mountain. Drop the iron, friend. I just want the food. And a warm bed. Maybe whoever is cooking in there to warm it for me." Gideon's eyes went dead. A cold, absolute fury settled over him. It wasn't the fury of a man protecting his property. It was the primal, violent rage of a man protecting his own. "You're trespassing!" Gideon said, his voice dropping an octave, sounding like rocks grinding together. "Turn around. Walk back down the trail." "I ain't walking nowhere. I'm taking what's inside." The drifter snarled his finger, whitening on the trigger. Before either man could pull their trigger, the front door of the cabin swung open. The drifter half-turned his gun, wavering. Carolina stood in the doorway. She wasn't cowering. She had the Winchester raised, the shortened stock tucked perfectly against her shoulder, her cheek pressed to the wood, her pale blue eyes staring down the iron sights. The barrel was aimed directly at the center of the drifter's chest. "Drop it," Carolina commanded. Her accent was thick, her voice steady and flat. The drifter looked at her, stunned by the sight of the gaunt, fierce woman holding a rifle with the ease of a soldier. He hesitated, his mind clouded by starvation and freezing temperatures. He looked back at Gideon, then at Carolina. He made the wrong choice. He thought she wouldn't shoot. He jerked the Colt toward her. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. They shattered the silence of the mountain, echoing off the granite peaks like a thunderclap. The drifter was thrown backward off the porch, landing flat on his back in the crusted snow. Gideon stood with his revolver smoking. Carolina stood in the doorway, the lever of the Winchester already racked halfway down to load a second round. They both stared at the body. A dark crimson stain began to spread rapidly across the pristine white snow beneath the drifter's chest. Gideon slowly lowered his gun. He looked at the dead man. Then he looked up at Carolina. She lowered the rifle. She wasn't shaking. She looked at the body, then met Gideon's eyes. "I had him," she said simply. Gideon walked over to the body. He kicked the drifter's gun out of reach, but the man was already gone. Gideon looked back at the doorway. Carolina was still standing there, the rifle held casually at her side, framed by the dark timber of the cabin. In that moment, Gideon realized the profound, terrifying truth. The winter was ending. The snow would melt. The contract of board for labor would expire. But looking at her, at the soot on her cheek, the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes, the way she had stood ready to kill, to protect their home, he knew he could never let her walk down that mountain. She wasn't his housekeeper. She was his partner. She was the only thing in the world that made the crushing silence of the mountains bearable. "I know you did," Gideon said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He holstered his gun and walked up the steps toward her. "Let's get inside. The apples are burning." He stepped past her into the cabin. Carolina lingered for a moment, looking out at the vast, deadly beauty of the frozen world. She pulled the heavy wooden door shut, bolting it from the inside, locking the world out and locking herself in with him. April did not arrive on the mountain. It attacked it. The thaw was not a gentle awakening of green shoots and soft breezes. It was a violent, noisy unearthing. The frozen creek at the bottom of the ridge swelled and shattered its ice dams with concussive cracks that echoed like artillery fire through the canyons. The snowpack didn't melt so much as it rotted, turning from a pristine white shield into a treacherous knee-deep grey slush that sucked the boots right off a man's feet. The air smelled of wet pine needles, exposed dirt, and the raw, damp breath of a waking wilderness. The mountain was unlocking itself, and with it the cabin. Gideon spent his days in the lean-to, standing over the stretching frames. The air inside the small timber shed was thick and heavy, reeking of raw animal fat, blood, and curing salt. He worked a dull draw-knife over the inside of a beaver pelt, scraping the last clinging bits of gristle away before rubbing handfuls of coarse salt into the hide. Usually this was the only time of year Gideon felt something akin to satisfaction. A stack of prime, thick winter furs meant survival. It meant heavy silver coins. It meant he had beaten the mountain for another year. This year, every scrape of the blade felt like a hammer driving a nail into his own coffin. He paused, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his forearm. Through the gaps in the lean-to logs, he watched Carolina. She was in the muddy yard, splitting the last of the winter logs. The gaunt, hollow-eyed ghost he had dragged out of the oboe alley was gone, buried under 6 months of brutal labor and venison fat. She swung the heavy iron maul with a rhythmic, devastating efficiency. Her canvas jacket was discarded on a stump, the sleeves of her flannel shirt rolled up past her elbows. Lean, hard muscle corded along her forearms with every swing. She didn't flinch when the wood split. She just kicked the halves aside, set a new log, and swung again. She was magnificent. She was terrifying. She was a woman entirely forged by the frontier, and their contract was up. Board for labor through the winter. That was the transaction. The winter was dead. That evening the temperature dropped just enough to harden the mud in the clearing. They sat on the small wooden porch under the deep overhang of the sod roof. The sky was a bruised, dark purple, bleeding out the last of the daylight. The only sound was the distant, relentless roar of the runoff water tearing through the valley below. Gideon sat on an overturned crate. He had his heavy hunting knife in his right hand and a small, oiled whetstone in his left. Shk, shk. He dragged the steel across the stone. The rhythm was steady, mechanical. He kept his eyes fixed on the blade. He hadn't looked at her directly since supper. "The pass is clear," Gideon said. His voice was gravel-dry and rough. Carolina sat in the rocking chair he had built years ago. She had a piece of harness leather in her lap, rubbing neat's foot oil into the stiff hide to soften it for the mules. She didn't stop rubbing. She didn't look up. "It is mud," she replied quietly. "It's passable," Gideon corrected. "The mules will sink, but they won't break a leg. We load the furs tomorrow. We leave the day after." "Shh." Shk. The knife scraped the stone. Carolina's thumb pressed hard into the leather. I will pack the dried meat. We need to check the rigging on the pack saddles. The canvas is frayed on the left side. Gideon stopped the knife. He wiped the steel clean on his thigh, sheathed it, and set the whetstone down. He reached deep into the inside pocket of his oilskin coat. His fingers closed around a heavy, tightly drawn leather pouch. It weighed roughly 2 pounds. It felt like holding a live grenade. He pulled it out and tossed it onto the small wooden table between them. It hit the boards with a dull, heavy clink, the unmistakable sound of coined silver. "That's your cut," Gideon stated. He kept his voice entirely flat. He stripped it of any warmth, any hesitation. He made himself sound like the foreman of a mine paying off a shift worker. "Half the money from the lower cash I sold to Morgan before the snow hit. You earned it." Carolina finally stopped moving. Her hands went perfectly still on the oiled leather. She looked at the pouch. It sat there, fat and heavy in the dim light. "You kept the fire." Gideon continued, forcing the words out. "You kept me breathing when the blood poison hit my arm. I'd be rotting under the floorboards if it weren't for you. That money is enough for a train ticket east, Chicago, New York, or you can go west to San Francisco. You can buy proper clothes, eat in a restaurant with glass windows, go anywhere but Obo." Carolina stared at the leather pouch. Her pale blue eyes caught the faint light of the stars. She didn't reach for it. She looked at it with a profound, quiet disgust, as if he had just slapped a dead rat on the table. "You are paying me off," she said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "I'm paying what's owed." Gideon fired back his tone, hardening defensively. He finally looked at her, meeting her gaze. He wanted her to understand. He needed her to understand that he was saving her. "A deal is a deal, Carolina. The winter broke. You survived. But you don't belong in a mud-chinked box on a rock 60 miles from a doctor or a decent meal. You got a stake now. You can go find a real life." The silence that followed was suffocating. The roar of the distant water seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of their breathing. Carolina set the harness leather down on the floorboards. She stood up slowly. She was tall, and in the fading light she cast a long shadow across the porch. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She didn't touch the silver. "A real life," she repeated. The words rasped in her throat, dry and hollow. She looked down at him. There was no anger in her face, only a bone-deep weariness that made Gideon's chest ache. "I will check the mules," she said. She stepped off the porch, her boots crunching on the freezing mud, and disappeared into the dark toward the lean-to. Gideon sat alone in the shadows. He stared at the leather pouch sitting on the table. He had survived mine collapses, grisly attacks, and blizzards that buried men standing up. He had never been afraid of the dark. But as he watched her walk away, the crushing, absolute isolation of the mountain pressed down on him, and he realized he was terrified. The ride down the mountain took 3 days. It was a miserable descent through a world of grey mud and rotting snow. They rode in silence. The comfortable shared quiet of the cabin had been replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension. Every mile they dropped in elevation felt like a physical weight pressing down on them. When they finally broke through the tree line and saw Obo in the valley below, Carolina pulled her sway-backed mare to a halt. The town looked like a festering scar against the greening valley, a chaotic sprawl of canvas tents, raw lumber saloons, and smoke belching from the silver smelters. Even from a mile away she could hear the mechanical grinding of the stamp mills and smell the sour stench of sulphur-unwashed bodies and spilled whiskey. She felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. 6 months ago she was starving in an alley there. The town represented everything she had fled: helplessness, degradation, the casual cruelty of desperate men. Gideon rode up beside her. He saw the way her knuckles whitened on the reins. He saw the pale, washed-out blue of her eyes harden into chips of ice. "Keep the rifle across your lap," Gideon ordered roughly. "You ain't the same girl they saw in October. Don't look at the ground. You look 'em dead in the eye." Carolina nodded once. She drew the shortened Winchester from its saddle scabbard and laid it across the pommel of her saddle. They rode into Obo. The main thoroughfare was a river of churned mud and horse manure. Miners, teamsters, and drifters clogged the boardwalks. Men stopped and stared as they passed. They remembered Gideon, the giant, scarred recluse. But they didn't recognize the woman riding beside him. She sat tall in the saddle, her jaw set, holding a repeater with the casual ease of a gunfighter. She didn't shrink under their stares. She met them. And one by one the men looked away. They tied the animals outside Morgan's mercantile. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and stale tobacco. Morgan was behind the counter weighing a bag of flour for a prospector. He looked up, wiped his hands on his apron, and his jaw dropped. "I'll be damned," Morgan breathed. "Gideon, you made it." His eyes shifted to Carolina. He blinked clearly, struggling to reconcile the fierce, healthy woman standing before him with the starving immigrant he had recommended. "And the girl. Lord above, I figured I'd be selling Gideon a shovel to bury you by November." "Need to weigh the pelts, Morgan?" Gideon said, cutting off the pleasantries. He hauled 2 massive burlap sacks onto the counter. The heavy thud shook the floorboards. Morgan spent the next hour examining the furs. He was a shrewd businessman, but he knew better than to cheat Gideon. He counted out the payment in heavy gold eagles and silver dollars, sliding the stacks across the scratched glass counter. "Prime catch, Gideon. Best I've seen this season," Morgan said, sweeping the furs away. He leaned on the counter, looking at Carolina. "So winter's over? What now, miss you, looking for work in town? I could use a clerk. Pay is fair. You wouldn't have to haul water up a mountain." Gideon's hand paused over his stack of coins. He didn't look up. He didn't say a word. He just waited. The air in the mercantile suddenly felt impossibly thick. Carolina looked at Morgan. She looked at the dusty shelves, the jars of pickled eggs, the bolts of cheap calico. Then she looked out the dirty window at the mud, the staggering drunks, the absolute chaos of civilization. She turned her gaze to Gideon. He was staring at the counter, his jaw muscles working, his massive shoulders rigid beneath his oilskin coat. He was giving her the choice. He would not trap her. "No," Carolina said. Her voice was flat, carrying no room for negotiation. "I do not work in town." Morgan looked surprised, then shrugged. "Suit yourself. Stagecoach leaves for Denver tomorrow morning at 8. You can buy a ticket over at the depot. We need supplies." Carolina continued, ignoring him entirely. She stepped up to the counter, her presence dominating the space. 100 pounds of flour, 20 of salt, the good coffee, not the dust, 10 pounds of sugar, and a block of sulfur matches. Morgan blinked. He looked at Gideon for confirmation. Gideon slowly looked up. The rigid tension in his shoulders broke. A slow, subtle shift occurred in his eyes, a flicker of something that looked dangerously like hope. "You heard the lady," Gideon said, his gravelly voice dropping an octave. "Load the wagon, and put it on my account." Carolina didn't smile. She didn't blush. She simply picked up her leather pouch of silver from the counter, walked out the front door, and stood guard by the mules, her hand resting near the lever of her rifle. She wasn't leaving. They camped that night a mile outside of Obo, near the edge of the tree line, where the mud gave way back to solid rock and pine needles. The noise of the town was a dull, distant roar, easily drowned out by the crackle of their campfire. The air was tense. It was a different kind of tension than before. It was the heavy, loaded silence of 2 people standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see who would jump first. Gideon was tending to his horse's hooves, picking stones from the frogs. Carolina was boiling coffee. The firelight danced across her face, casting long, shifting shadows. "The stage leaves at 8, Gideon said quietly, not looking up from the hoof in his hands. Carolina poured the boiling black liquid into a tin cup. She set the pot back on the coals. "I know how to read a clock. You bought 100 pounds of flour today." Gideon pressed, dropping the horse's hoof and turning to face her. "That's winter rations. You're planning on staying." Carolina picked up the cup and walked over to him. She handed it to him. Her fingers brushed his scarred and calloused against thick, battered skin. "The roof needs a new main beam," she said, looking him dead in the eye. "The old one is bowing under the weight of the sod. If it snows heavy next November, it will cave in. You cannot